I was just reading the Bible with the Founders by Daniel Drisback. Just praying about it, getting some ideas. Look at America as second Israel. Can you truly say that she is, right? Because I know, like, people say, like, America's Babylon because of the wickedness that's going on inside of her. All this wickedness you see, right? Well, not really. It's like America. I wouldn't say America is Babylon. Just like if Israel was taken, when Israel was taken captive by Babylon, it doesn't mean Israel becomes Babylon. It's just, the nation, basically, or the people, they come out with, like, I don't know, different principles or something. The principles of Babylonian thinking, which I would say that America have been taken captive by a type of Babylon. But I wanted to read this quote in this book. It's from John Adams to Benjamin Rush, February 2nd, 1807. John Adams says, "The Bible contains the most profound philosophy, the most perfect morality, and the most refined policy that ever was conceived upon earth. It is the most Republican book in the world, and therefore I will still revere it. Without national morality, a Republican government cannot be maintained." And so you would consider the Bible a Republican book. That's kind of what I was, like, saying, right? How, like, America's republicanism is biblical, meaning it comes from the Hebrew tradition of republicanism when they were the 12 tribes, right? And how it's not really from Rome, right? Like the Roman republics or Plato's Republic, I think it was. So our tradition doesn't come from that. It's not based on that. It has its heritage in the Bible. And this is why you can technically say that, like John Adams, I think he's the same guy that says that is not founded upon the Christian religion, the form of government. Well, yeah, even if it's a Christian republic, right? America, it's founded upon the Hebrew Republic. So it's really founded upon, the Old Testament's, religion, I guess, or if I could say that. But you could technically say it's still Bible-based. Our republic, our form of government is based on. So I'm trying to. This just talks about chosen nation. It says America was, or hoped she would be, God's chosen nation and new Israel. For some, America was at least analogous to ancient Israel, and they believed lessons could be drawn from the comparison. Others thought that they could, quote-unquote, discover America and God's providential plans for America in the Bible. The early Puritans especially sought to learn lessons from God's dealings with the Hebrew Commonwealth. A ubiquitous theme in the literature of Puritan New England and later the literature of the founding era was that the American experience was analogous to that of the children of Israel exiting slavery in Egypt. The precise contours of the analogy differ depending on who made it and when, but they were often elaborate, even tortured comparisons. Significantly, even Americans most influenced by the Enlightenment and skeptical of the miraculous aspects of the Exodus account embraced this theme. North American settlers view England, the land of political repression and religious intolerance from which they fled, as their Egypt, the Stuart monarch, and later in the Revolutionary era, George III, as their intransient Pharaoh, and the treacherous waters in the Atlantic Ocean, as the Red Sea. In some versions, the Atlantic represented the Jordan River, which, like the children of Israel, the colonists traversed from east to west into the Promised Land, say quote-unquote Promised Land. Some Americans even observed that the population of the United States at the time of independence, 3 million people, was approximately the same as the number of Israelites with Moses in the wilderness. Says many Americans of the founding era came to regard George Washington as their Moses, who led them out of bondage. and into a quote this is quote promised land, end quote. And then this is to the colonists directed their ambitious. And this is the political leadership and laws of Moses recorded in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy had special meaning for these colonists and directed their ambitious errand into a new promised land where they were called of God to build a quote city on a hill, end quote. Matthew 5:14. Says he also 2 Samuel 7:10-16. Says God, as his quote, God's American Israel, end quote. This narrative is reflected in the names New England settlers gave to their communities, which were the names of geographic locations recorded in the Hebrew Scriptures: Bethel, Canaan, Goshen, Hebron, Salem, and so on. So some late 18th century Americans were drawn to the words of the Old Testament prophets. The prophet Micah, who lived in the 8th century BC and ministered at a time when Israel was governed by a dissolute ruler and threatened by neighboring empires, was even described as a, quote, son of liberty, end quote. One of the American colonists who organized in opposition to oppose British rule. It says that 17th and 18th century rhetoric routinely appealed to and appropriated Old Testament prophetic language and jeremiads directed towards the children of Israel, as if these prophetic words were spoken directly to Americans, or at least were relevant to their time and place, at the very least. It was believed that God's special relationship with the Hebrew nation modeled God's exceptional attention to and plans for America. So this theme that America was God's chosen nation was embraced by both pious and skeptical citizens, woven into the national mythology and manifested in diverse national expressions and symbols. The Reverend Israel Evans, one of General Washington's favorite military chaplains, was appointed by the Commander-in-Chief to deliver a Thanksgiving sermon to victorious troops near Yorktown, Virginia, and the occasion of General Cornwallis' surrender in October 1781. In a poem purportedly addressed to the assembled soldiers and appended to a published text of the discourse, Evans struck this familiar theme, saying, "To him who led in ancient days the Hebrew tribes your anthems raise, the God who spoke from Sinah's hill protects his chosen people still." This is the president of Yale College, Ezra Stiles, delivered a 1783 election sermon before Connecticut's highest officials. His text was Deuteronomy 26:19, a passage describing God's promise to exalt the nation of Israel if her people remain a, quote, holy people, end quote, which Stiles declared was, quote, elusively prophetic of the future prosperity and splendor of the United States, end quote, God's American Israel, end quote. And it says, one proponent, Congregationalist clergyman, declared in a 1788 election sermon entitled, quote, the Republic of the Israelites, an example to the American states, end quote, that, quote, instead of the 12 tribes of Israel, we may substitute the 13 states of the American Union, end quote. I'll stop there on this book. Just talking about I'm going to read from the American Zion, from Iran Shall Live. And the idea, I guess, is that, is it wrong to see yourself as an Israel? Right, like I said earlier, like, is America a true Israel? I mean, I believe she is, right? And this is here in this book, on the chapter on tribes lost and found, Israelites in 19th century America. It goes over the Book of Mormon or so, just over the history of that book as well. Like, it accounts for it, how it's a type of pseudo-biblicism, I think it was, based on an early American tradition, right? How in early America it was common to substitute, to write the American history in the form of scripture, right? And let me see, in this book, because it has a quote. As well, like how it's very common. There's plenty of quotes like this from reverends and stuff like that in early America. So basically I would consider it part of the early American tradition as far as the identity of this country. It was from Abiel Abbott, 1798. He states, "Our American Israel is a term frequently used." And then this chapter says, "We have already seen how visions of America as a, quote, second Israel, end quote, or readings of specific narratives of covenant, chosenness, and exodus that link the United States with Israelite history were standard since the Puritan migration and settlement. While such topological understandings were commonly confined to colonial New England, heightened revolutionary anxieties and a disproportionate influence of a Calvinist political culture on the new nation brought about a broad and spectacular flurry of comparisons between the young United States and biblical Israel after 1776. Such expressions, while not a strictly New England or even a Congregationalist trait, were widespread. Were widespread, and according to a modern scholar, part of a, quote, consistent effort to cast America as the modern Jewish nation, end quote. With the evangelical millennial storm of the Second Great Awakening gathering after the start of the 19th century, the War of 1812 begot a potent and revitalized American patriotism. The combustive combination of millenarianism and intense wartime patriotism enabled public speakers to further deepen the links between the early American Republic and biblical Israel. John MacDonald's Isaiah's Message to the American Nation, a new translation of Isaiah, chapter 28, 1814, may have been the most striking example of the power of this mixture. It is an extraordinary exegesis of the Hebraic prophet Isaiah's observed divination regarding a, quote, distant country, end quote. Says MacDonald interpreted the prophecies by comparing it with America, end quote. He was in no doubt that Isaiah described, quote, the picture of our own country painted by our own God, end quote, concluding decisively that the, quote, the nation addressed in Isaiah 18 must be America, end quote. While MacDonald's message to the American nation stood out as an unabashedly patriotic and nationalistic reading of the Bible, a manifestly prevalent mindset that habitually linked America to the Bible through typological exegesis such as understanding of the United States through a biblical lenses, whereby the Israelite nation foreshadowed the United States, which in turn fulfilled a biblical type, bore the clear and time-proven marks of Christian typology. Contemporaries relied on a millennia-long exegetical tradition, namely typology, which was originally developed as an interpretive tool to connect the Old and New Testaments. Now, however, political typologists mobilized this interpretational mode to connect the Old Testament with the American Republic. Such appellations were typological in essence, perceiving the relation of an early promise, biblical Israel, and its fulfillments, the United States, in which America was represented not as Israel, but as a second Israel, or God's new Israel. Such typological descriptions and ascriptions made clear that the connection between the two Israels was in its essence metaphorical, non-ontological, or real. In this view, the two nations may have corresponded through the historical roles they played, but the essence of that correspondence was symbolic, not necessarily one that was tangible or obvious. Stop there. So the idea, right, is the way you see yourself, is the way you see your nation is important. Now, all of that, right, and the American founding, you could say, is that based on human reason, that it's a human idea to think of yourself as such a people, or is it a divinely inspired idea, right? Like how God finds people, how he chooses people, right? How God sets apart a people for himself through his providence. And so, I don't know, the idea is like, is it human or not, right? Because I believe the idea of a chosen nation, America's, identities, seeing itself as a second Israel is divinely inspired, like a divine idea from God for its purpose, right? Serve a purpose. I have this book, Exploding the Israel Deception by Steve Olberg. And in it, talk about the shocking principle of two Israels, which Have you ever been hit so hard on the head that you started seeing double? Well, from what I have studied, the Christian world needs to get hit hard on the head with the truth of the New Testament. Then more Christians will start seeing double about the subject of Israel. According to the New Testament, there are now two Israels. The proof, as Paul wrote, quote, "They are not all Israel, which are of Israel," end quote. Romans 9:6. This is the emphasis added in this chapter. We will discover that there is an Israel. This is, quote, "according to the flesh," end quote. Romans 9:3. And an Israel. This is, quote, "in Israel of God," end quote. Galatians 6:16. Composed of both Jews and Gentiles who have personal faith in Jesus Christ. Paul wrote, quote, "even as Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. Now know ye, therefore, that they which are of faith, the same are the children of Abraham," end quote. Galatians 3:6-7. Paul's argument is that Abraham had faith, therefore those who have faith are his children. We might call this the concept of, quote, faith lineage, end quote. This truth is like a key that can open a lock in our heads. Once the lock is open, then we can understand the shocking principle of two Israels. John the Baptist understood and boldly preached the truth of, quote, faith lineage, end quote. This is, quote, "in those days came John the Baptist preaching in the wilderness," end quote. This is a quote, "but when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees come to his baptism, he said unto them," end quote. This is, quote, "think not to say within yourselves, we have Abraham to our father. For I say unto you that God is able of these stones to raise up children unto Abraham. And now also the axe is laid unto the root of these trees. Therefore every tree which bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire," end quote. Matthew 3:1, 7, 9, 10. Those Pharisees and Sadducees were part of Israel according to the flesh. They did not have faith like Abraham did, yet they thought they were his children. John the Baptist exposed this delusion. He says, "He thundered," this is, quote, don't think that," end quote. John said, John then laid the, quote unquote, axe to the root of the trees by saying that if those men did not bear, quote, good fruit, end quote, through faith like Abraham did, then they would be, quote, hewn down and cast into the fire, end quote. Verse 10. Thus natural lineage by itself is not enough. Without faith and a spiritual connection with God, those men were doomed. Jesus Christ taught the same truth. A certain group of Jews once said to him, quote, "Abraham is our father," end quote. It says, Jesus responded, quote, "if you were Abraham's children, you would do the works of Abraham," end quote. John 8:39. They claimed to be Abraham's children, but they had no faith. By saying, quote, "if ye were Abraham's children," end quote, Jesus denied their claim. Christ continued, but it says, quote, "but now ye seek to kill me, a man that have told you the truth. This did not Abraham yet do the deeds of your father," end quote. John 8:41. They responded, quote, "we have one Father, even God," end quote. Then, quote, Jesus said unto them, "if God were your Father, ye would love me, for I proceeded forth and came from God," end quote. It says, quote, "ye are of your father the devil, and the lusts of your father ye will do. He was a murderer from the beginning, and abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh of his own, for he is a liar and the father of it," end quote. This is, quote, "he that is of God heareth God's words. Ye therefore hear them not, because ye are not of God," end quote. John 8:41, 42, 44, 47. What an atomic text. Here Jesus Christ himself spoke words that blast into shivers a large proportion. Blast into shivers a large proportion of the prophetic theories currently held in the evangelical world. Jesus was talking to people who claimed to be Israelites, the children of Abraham, yet they were only the Israel of the flesh. Jesus said they were not really Abraham's children at all because they had no faith and were following lies. Their lineage actually went back to Satan, the father of lies. Soon we will separate God's truth from Satan's lies when we look at what Revelation really teaches about Israel, the 144,000, Babylon, and Armageddon. So Jesus Christ also taught the same concept of, quote, faith lineage, end quote. In John chapter 1, a spiritually minded Jew named Nathanael was wondering whether Jesus of Nazareth was really the Messiah. Retiring to a favorite spot under a fig tree, he prayed about the matter. Soon a friend introduced him to the Savior. When Jesus saw Nathanael coming to him, he said, quote, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom is no guile." End quote. John 1:47. Nathanael had a natural lineage that went back to Abraham, yet he had more. In his spiritual life he had gained victories over guile, which means deception. When Jesus discerned Nathanael's spiritual lineage to Abraham and Jacob, he called him, quote, "an Israelite indeed." End quote. Therefore, just as the man Jacob became a spiritual Israel, even so had this man Nathanael become an Israelite indeed. He was part of God's true spiritual Israel. Just as there are now two Israels, even so are there now two kinds of Jews. There are Jews in the flesh and Jews in the spirit. In words of warning to certain Jews who were breaking the Ten Commandments, Paul wrote, quote, "Behold, thou art called a Jew, and restest in the law, and makest thy boast of God." End quote. It says, quote, "For circumcision verily profiteth, if thou keep the law. But if thou be a breaker of the law, thy circumcision is made uncircumcision. Therefore, if the uncircumcision, Gentiles, keep the righteousness of the law, they shall not his uncircumcision be counted for circumcision." End quote. It says, quote, "For he is not a Jew which is one outwardly, neither is he that circumcision which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew which is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart in the spirit, and not in the letter, whose praise is not of man but of God." End quote. Romans 2:17, 25, 26, 28, 29. I said, did you catch that? Someone who is called is quote, called a Jew, end quote, because he is a physical descendant of Abraham, and yet who lives as a lawbreaker, it says, quote, is not a Jew, end quote. His, quote, circumcision is made uncircumcision, end quote. To God he is a Gentile, and the believing Gentile who through faith keeps, quote, the righteousness of the law, end quote. His uncircumcision is, quote, counted for circumcision, end quote. Thus to God he is a Jew. The teachings of John the Baptist, Jesus Christ, and Paul all agree that natural lineage is not enough. Whether or not someone is, quote, an Israelite indeed, end quote, depends upon the person's faith and spiritual character. Paul summarized, quote, "For we are the circumcision which worship God in the Spirit, and rejoice in Jesus Christ, and have no confidence in the flesh." Quote, end quote. Philippians 3:3, anyone today can become one of these quote-unquote Jews, even if their father was Adolf Hitler. Even if their father was Adolf Hitler. I said these concepts of, quote, faith lineage, end quote, Jews being counted as Gentiles and Gentiles being counted as Jews, lead us into one of the biggest issues now facing the evangelical world. This issue is at the core of prophetic interpretation. In it, we are faced with two options. One is the truth, the other a lie. One leads to heaven, the other possibly to hell. The big question is, quote, what about the promises God made to Israel in the Old Testament, end quote. See, if we conclude that those promises must be fulfilled to the Israel of the flesh, then we must conclude that Jerusalem and the modern Jewish nation will eventually become the center of the final battle of Armageddon. But if we conclude that those promises can legitimately be fulfilled to God's Israel in the Spirit, then we must restudy the book of Revelation to discover how its end-time prophecies apply to Christians. Says Paul deals with the highly explosive issue in Romans 9:2-8. His words require careful thought, with, quote, continual sorrow, end quote, in his heart. Paul wrote about his Jewish, quote, kinsmen according to the flesh, who are Israelites, to whom pertaineth the adoption and the glory and the covenants and the giving of the law and the service of God and the promises, end quote. Verses 2-4. Emphasis added, says God did make it promises to Israel in the Old Testament. Yet what if some Jews do not believe in him? Can God fulfill his promises to an unbelieving Israel in the flesh? If not, has his word failed? Paul's answer to these questions, important questions, is clear. It says, quote, not as though the word of God have taken none effect, for they are not all Israel, which are of Israel, end quote. Verse 6, notice the concept of, quote, two Israels, end quote, is Paul's assurance that God's word will not fail. Look carefully, quote, they are not all Israel, the Israel of God, which are of Israel, the Jewish nation, end quote. Thus a Jew can be of the Jewish nation and yet not be part of Israel, of God. Now here is the highly explosive question, to which Israel will God fulfill his promises? Paul continues, quote, neither because they are the seed of Abraham are they all children, but in Isaac shall thy seed be called, end quote. Verse 7, since not all physical descendants of Abraham are automatically God's children, Therefore his promises are for those, quote, in Isaac, end quote. Abraham had 2 sons. The first was Ishmael, who was born after the flesh. The second was Isaac, who was born when Abraham had faith in God's promise. Genesis 16, 1-3, 15, 21, 1-3, Romans 4:18-21, and Galatians 4:22-31. Paul reveals that Ishmael represents unbelieving Jews, while Isaac represents both Jews and Gentiles who have faith. This is, quote, now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are the children of promise, end quote. Galatians 4:28. The children of promise are those who, quote, receive the promise of the Spirit through faith, end quote. Galatians 3:14. Therefore the Israel that is, quote, in Isaac, end quote, is the Israel of God in the Spirit. So Paul concludes, quote, that is, they which are the children of the flesh, these are not the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted for the seed, end quote. Romans 9:8. Here is a summary of Paul's reasoning. This is 1. In the Old Testament, God made promises to, quote, the seed of Abraham, end quote. 2. This, quote, seed, end quote, would continue, quote, in Isaac, end quote. 3. Isaac was born through faith. 4. Isaac represents those who have faith. 5. All who have faith, Jews and Gentiles, quote, are counted for the seed, end quote. This is 6. This seed is the, quote, Israel, end quote, of God. 7. God will fulfill his promises to this Israel. And 8. Therefore, quote, the word of God, end quote, to Israel has not been made of, quote, non-effect, end quote, even though some natural Jews do not believe. Thus we have the answer to the issue that means so much in prophetic interpretation. The Bible is clear. God will fulfill his Old Testament promises to those, quote, in Isaac, end quote, that is, to his Israel in the Spirit. Those who are only, quote, the children of the flesh, these are not children of God, but the children of the promise are counted for the seed, end quote. Romans 9:8, emphasis added. We should not expect God to fulfill his promises to an unbelieving Israel in the flesh, unless, of course, those natural Israelites choose to believe in Jesus Christ. We will examine one more atomic section before we close this chapter. It says, what about Paul's question? This is, quote, have God cast away his people, end quote, Romans 11:1. This verse is being quoted around the world to prove that God has not cast away the Israel of the flesh. Yet notice Paul's answer. It says, quote, God forbid, for I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, end quote. Notice that Paul uses himself as an example to prove that God has not, quote, cast away his people, end quote, who are, quote, his people, end quote. In the next 3 verses, Paul refers to ancient Israel's apostacies in the days of Elijah. And God said to Elijah, quote, I have reserved to myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to the image of Baal, end quote. Verse 4, in Elijah's time, there were also 2 Israels. One followed Baal, while the other followed God. Then Paul made this application. This is, quote, even so then as this present time, also there is a remnant according to the election of grace, end quote. Verse 5. Just as in Elijah's time there was a faithful remnant of Israel, even so in Paul's time there was also a faithful remnant of believing Jews, who like himself had been saved by grace, and these are God's people. It is this faithful remnant of spiritual Israel who God has certainly not, quote, cast away, end quote. Soon we will see this exact issue addressed in the book of Revelation, as in the days of Elijah. We are now in the midst of a terrible apostasy. Yet today God has his, quote, 7,000, end quote, who have not, quote, bowed the knee to Baal, end quote. They are his faithful remnant, his Israel in the Spirit. Like Elijah, they will be on the side of Jesus Christ and the truth of Armageddon. And that's the end of that chapter. The choice and the chosen nation. It talks about the chosen nation. It's like the conditions of, blessings and curses and stuff like that. And so you understand, right? Like, well, hold on. How there are 2 Israels, right? And Jesus being referred to as the second Adam. And so I want to read briefly from this book called Adam as Israel. Genesis 1-3 as the introduction to the Torah and Tanakh by Seth D. Postel. Just want to read from, it says Genesis 1-3, the Pentateuch, if I said that correctly, the Pentateuch or whatever, and the history of Israel. Apologize if I didn't say it correctly. Let me see, I think this is where I want to read. Let me see. It says several other studies elaborate the importance of Genesis 1 through 3 as the introduction to the Pentateuch, and included parallels between the opening chapters in Deuteronomic theology, as well as the remainder of the so-called, quote, primary history, end quote, Genesis 1 through 2, it says 2 Kings 25:30. Alonso Shokel was among the first scholars to call attention to parallels between the opening chapters of Genesis and the Historia Salutis, this is called the history of salvation, end quote, or quote, salvation history, end quote. He also pointed out a constellation of the terms found exclusively in the wisdom literature. It says Shokel noticed connections between Genesis 2 through 3, not only with key passages in the Pentateuch, but also with later events in the biblical history. His parallels noted by Shokel include 1. The narrative depiction of Adam's covenantal relationship with God in Genesis 2 through 3, and Israel's covenantal relationship to God in Exodus 19:34. It says covenant, sin, punishment, reconciliation. It says 2. The depiction of Adam's being taken from outside the garden and placed, or quote-unquote rested, inside it, and Israel's being brought from outside the land of Canaan and being placed inside it. See Genesis 2:15, Deuteronomy 3:20, 30, 3-4, Joshua 1:13-15, Jeremiah 27:11, Ezekiel 36:34, 37:14, 21, Isaiah 14:1. Says 3. Adam's downfall following his quote-unquote cleaving to a woman, and the downfall of Israel at Baal Peor, and also the downfall of Israel's subsequent kings due to their having cleaved to seductive women. This is 4. The apodictic laws of the garden and the apodictic laws of Sinai. And 5. The covenantal style of the consequence of disobedience in the garden and the consequence of disobedience to Sinai. So several scholars concur with Shokel's findings with respect to the relationship between Genesis 1 and 2 through 3, Deuteronomic theology, and Israel's biblical history. The following is a list of these scholars with abbreviated summaries of their findings in the footnotes. Joseph Blenkinsops, Carl R. Bovell, and says Marin Emmerich, Brian G. Toez, William J. Dumbra, and Terence Fritham. It gives a bunch of these quotations at the bottom. Let me see, it says, 34. Blenkinsop, the Pentateuch Introduction, 66. So also, for example, Gardner, this is quote Genesis 2:4b through 3, end quote, 15, who writes saying, this is quote, Genesis 3 can be viewed as a mythological interpretation of Israelite religious history from the time of the settlement, end quote. Gardner draws parallels between Eve's duplicity and Adam's downfall, with subsequent women in the Deuteronomistic history. See 1 Kings 11:4 through 3, 16:31 through 33, and the garden with the promised land, for the conviction of a redactional effort to link the Pentateuch and the Deuteronomy with the Deuteronomistic history. And it's talking about seed. I'm sorry, I think it says German or something. It's a different language. I can't pronounce this title. It says Bowell, quote, Genesis 3:21, end quote, 36:1. These are the pages 36:1 through 266, I guess. Bowell draws parallels between the serpent and the Canaanites and Adam's mandate to conquer the land and Israel's mandate to do the same. Bowell's primary thesis is that Genesis 3:21, the provision of the garments of skin, represents an attempt on the part of the exilic writers of the final composition of the Pentateuch to explain the exile to current and or subsequent readers that Israel had in fact become just like the inhabitants of Canaan. Adam and Eve are now dressed like the animals of the land, as if they had not kept the Torah and therefore they were no longer worthy of the land. It says, and then Emmerich's work provides a rare attempt to understand the temptation narrative as part of the Pentateuch, and in terms of its contribution to the primary history. Emmerich sees parallels between the gift of the garden and the gift of the promised land. These two trees representing life and death, and the Torah, the serpent, and the false prophets, Deuteronomy 13:1-3, and the woman of the garden and the woman who would later instigate Israel's apostasy from the Lord. And Toa's Genesis 1-4. So Toa's argument is broader than that of Bovel and Emmerich. He argues that Genesis 1-4 is the introduction proper to the entire OT and its theology, in addition to finding parallels between Genesis 1-3 and Israel's history. Towell's attempts to trace archetypical patterns introduced in Genesis 1-4 throughout the rest of the tripartite Hebrew canon. With respect to the relationship between Genesis 1-4 and the Pentateuch, Towell sees parallels between the dividings of the water and creation, and the dividing of the Red Sea, the Garden of Eden, and the Tabernacle, and the covenant theology of Genesis 2-3, and the book of Deuteronomy, in exile due to disobedience. And Dumbrell's Genesis 2:1-3, Dumbrell, Faith of Israel. Dumbrell notes that both Adam and Israel share royal priestly roles. See especially Genesis 1:26-28, Exodus 19:4-6. Both enjoy the conditional provisions of a divinely prepared land, and both lose access to divine space due to their transgression and exile. This is this one's Fritham Pentateuch. Although he does not deny the existence of different sources underlying Genesis 1-3, Fritham's commitments lie with the final form of the text. His desire to understand Genesis 1-3 as part of the Pentateuch leads him to the conclusion that these two trees, the giving of commandments and the choices of life and death, and the garden anticipate the giving of the law of Sinai, Deuteronomy 30:15-20. So Fritham argues that the juxtaposition of the very good creation with the subsequent entrance of sin, quote, dramatically portrays the need for a reclamation of creation, end quote, and demonstrates God's, quote, commitment to stay with the world, come what may, in the wake of human sinfulness, end quote. And continue reading. This is from within another faith tradition. T.V. Ehrlich, an Israelite scholar. Sorry if I mispronounced that. This is an Israeli scholar, writing in modern Hebrew, also finds numerous links between the story of the Garden of Eden and the story of Israel's sojourn at Mount Sinai. On the basis of numerous intertextual links between these two narratives, Ehrlich argues that Sinai and the Tabernacle had a return from exile in a special land prepared by God, or depicted as a solution to Adam's sin, or as he describes it, and this is these Hebrew words I can't pronounce. Although Ehrlich discusses the similarities between Eden and Sinai, he argues that the distinctions between these two narratives are the key for one's interpretation and assessment of the theological import of Sinai within the Pentateuch. Although both narratives recount sin and retreat, this is Hebrew words that I can't pronounce. As a careful comparison reveal important and exegetically significant differences at this point, it would be helpful to reproduce a portion of Ehrlich's charts, and then highlights the similarities and key differences between the two narratives. It just gives a big chart here. It's a picture. Let me see. But you understand, right? Like how it draws parallels, like between Adam and Israel, and how Jesus, right? As I said, it's considered the how Israel, right? Adam is considered Israel, or Israel is considered Adam, right? And they're covenant based. And so I'm saying that how Jesus, right? How Paul says that Jesus is the second Adam, right? Which makes him the second Israel. And so this is why I said, like, the church comes from the body of the second Israel. And so it comes from the new Adam, right? The Adam born of heaven, the one who has the Redeemer of all humanity, right? The Savior of all man. So we are of his flesh and body. So just like Eve is of the flesh of Adam, so the church is of the flesh of Jesus, right? And so the true Israel, right, are those who are faithful to God. And so it's by covenant. And so it is by having faith in Jesus, right, and being baptized into his covenant and keeping his statutes according to how he interprets the statutes and laws, right? And because it's different from Moses, the interpretation of the law. And so basically it's like a faithful covenantal community, I guess. But the idea certainly is there, right? About how, like, the bride of Christ, the church, is of his new humanity, right? Because the old has been fulfilled, how Jesus fulfilled both Adam and Israel, right? Their faithfulness, because he is the Word of God. He who is faithful is Jesus. And so this is what I said, that the church is from the new Israel, of his redeemed flesh, right? Of his spiritual flesh, if I could say. And so he gives us a birthright to be children of God, right? And so this is what I'm saying, like, and also in my book, I mean, not my book, I'm sorry, my video on mystery of the church and the various interpretations of Israel, and how Israel can be Israel can be considered not just a covenant people, but a covenant nation, right? And so that's what I asked, like, if the idea of America considering itself a second Israel, or you know, it's its identity, right? All of that, is that based on human reason, or is that built upon divine inspiration, right? Because the Christian people I would consider as technically the covenant people, right? Because it's hard to to pick an institution like these religious Christian institutions, but it's really the Christian people, like, it's up to God to whoever truly is of Him and who's not, right? But it's basically this people, and you see, like, what I was saying, I'm just down topic. The idea, right, of like your form of government being based upon the Bible, the biblical republicanism, if I would call it, because we're not from the republic of like Plato or Roman republics. We're built upon the foundation of the Bible, or our foundation is built upon the Bible, right? So basically, we talk about the Continental Congress, I think it was called, or what was it called? I can't remember. I'm sorry, I'm tired. But the idea, right, is certainly there, that America is a true, like, covenant Israel, a covenant land, a covenant people. The fact that you have many covenantal-minded people, Christians, right, even though they were Protestants and had problems with their understanding, right, of covenant, and their theologies are problematic, but still the American nation is founded upon, like, your identity being centered around being second Israel, being a covenant Christian nation, right? Because you have all these covenanters and things like that, and then also your republican, your form of government is built upon the biblical Hebrewism or Hebraic tradition of republicanism, and how your Constitution has biblical roots, right? And so the Bible is the main inspiring document. It's like the primary one, at least. And so all of these things, like how Washington speaks of of his experiences with Divine Providence, how even he and James Madison considered the documents inspired, right? I think it was the Declaration, I think it was. Meanwhile, some others don't. Like, I think John Adams didn't think it was inspired. I think it was a Declaration, right? Or Constitution. But the idea is, right, about all of this, right? Is it based on human reason, or is it based upon divine inspiration? And so this is where I said that if America is a covenant Christian nation, she can rightfully be referred to as a second Israel, right? Because Jesus is the second Adam. That makes him the second Israel. And so all people, all nations who are covenant with him can consider themselves that without all this, confusing genealogy of chasing lost tribes, right? Basing it on race. When you base it on faith in Christ and covenant with Christ. And so certainly it's like basically it's like God confirmed his covenant with America when we won all these wars in the American Revolution. We won all these battles in the American Revolutionary War, and we gained our independence. And so you could say technically like that America is conceived in Christian covenantalism, not just in God-given liberty, but America is conceived in being a Christian covenant nation, so to say. And so, like 1776, I bought this book called 1726, The Year That Defined America. It just goes over, it says, when a nation goes down or a society perishes, one condition may always be found, that they forget where they came from, that they lost sight of what had brought them along. This is from Carl Sandburg, that quote. So 1726 was a defining year for America. 1776 would never have happened apart from 1726. The Great Awakening that began that year transformed colonial America and laid the spiritual, moral, and philosophical foundations for the beginning of a great nation. It also unleashed the anti-slavery sentiments and moral outrage, and that eventually brought about the end of slavery in America. So this is a story of America that has been censored from modern textbooks. It is a story of the faith and spiritual vision of those who brought this nation into existence. I'm just talking about this goes over like briefly, like, I'm sorry, I'm tired. Let me see. Let's talk about that 1619 project, that stuff. I think that was 1726, The Year That Defined America by Eddie L. Hayat. This is chapter 1 of the redefining of America. To destroy a people, you must first sever their roots. Alexander Shulutzin, I can't pronounce his last name. For the first 150 years of American existence, no one questioned the axiom, America is a Christian nation. This did not mean that everyone was a Christian or that the nation officially sanctioned any denomination or religious sect. It meant instead that the nation's laws and institutions were founded on Christian principles and values. This fact was as stated by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1892 in the case of Church of the Holy Trinity versus the United States. After examining thousands of historical documents, the nation's highest court declared, saying, there is no dissonance in these declarations. There is a universal language pervading them all. Having one meaning, they affirm and reaffirm that this is a religious nation. From the discovery of this continent to the present hour, there is a single voice making this affirmation, and these and many other matters, which might be noticed at a volume of unofficial declarations of the mass of organic utterances, that this is a Christian nation. This truth concerning America's overt Christian history was acknowledged in a December 1982 article in Newsweek entitled, quote, How the Bible Made America, end quote. It contained this insightful statement, saying, for centuries the Bible has exerted an unrivaled influence on American culture, politics, and social life. And now historians are discovering that the Bible, perhaps even more than the Constitution, is our founding document, the source of the powerful myths of the United States as a special sacred nation, a people called by God to establish a model of society, a beacon to the world. As is this reality of America being a Christian nation was expressed in American culture by Bible reading and praying being common occurrences in all kinds of public settings. Until the 1960s, it was common for school days, school activities, sporting events, city councils, meetings, and other public events to open with prayer. Displays of the Bible, verses, crosses, and Ten Commandments were common in public buildings, including courtrooms. It was normal for a baccalaureate sermon, if I pronounced that correctly, sermon by a local pastor to be part of public school graduation exercises. Yeah, so the Bible verses, crosses, and Ten Commandments, right? Like Ten Commandments, like that's what I'm saying. It's like we have all this because it's not that it's just based on our, I guess, our religious principles of the Christian faith, right, and things like that. But it's also because, our form of government is Bible based, and so this is why it's like it can't be both secular and godless, especially if you have like the people who wrote the Declaration and the framers and all of them. How they prayed. Like I was reading from the book Two Wings by Novak, and how it says that they pray to God for assistance and guidance, right? Appealing to His providence or God's providence, right, that God will provide. And certainly you could say that God has provided for America. How shall you self-govern, right? That is the question that was basically prayed. How they depended on God for victory over in the Revolutionary Wars, and then afterwards when they wondered what form of government should we have, right? And so all of it, I believe, is divine. Is divine inspiration, divine ideas, like your American reality, the American identity, the American Zion, the American Israel, right? Second Israel, America, right? Your biblical reality, how you're based upon Hebrew metaphysics and Christian covenantalism, and basically biblical metaphysics, right? You have a biblical government. Republicanism built it upon, the Bible, and federalism, right? Built upon the Bible. And you have your founders who are really not anti-Christian, they see God as friend, ally. They seem to love Jesus, but they seem to be more concerned, not with theology or, theological dogma. They seem more concerned with giving you a godly government and more like a national morality, so to say. And so I believe that the founders are God-given, that God provided your identity, your founders, their writings, your identity being the American Zion, and then what else? A form of government. I believe God provided more than just success on the battlefield and things like that, and so God provided more for this nation, and so all of that is important, right? Because it's like what's going on today. How you have like all sorts of poisonous education being taught in the education system, anti-Christian values, right? And then how like some of these godless secularists and progressives, how they also have vision for America to be godless, to progress away from God, right? And so I say they also have vision and ambition, right? So they're not trying to conserve anything. They're not conservatives, but I don't know. Like I just know that how is it that they would have all this success? That's because they believe, and I really believe it's because they participate in a reality that they really believe in, that they really see America as a secular nation, as a godless nation, that it's just a product of human brilliance and enlightenment, right? And so that's why I said that, like Orthodoxy, right? Orthodox Christianity, reality and vision is stressed. How you believe is how you participate in reality, right? How you see reality. It's very important. And so this is what I said, is why I bring this up about America's identity, the reality America is built upon, a biblical reality. Therefore, we define liberty and freedom and moral and ethics according to what is biblical, and basically, you can say, according to what is like, according to the apostolic tradition, as testified in the scriptures, right? Because you shouldn't be allowing people to redefine freedom and liberty and what is moral, what is good, and the education system. It becomes more godless, right? So a secular nation, that's what I call like the godless secular nation, right? That the progressives and secularists come up with. That I would say that is more of the American Babylon, right? If I could say that, because the American Zion is very different. The American Zion is built up on, basically it's founded by God, because God is set apart a people for himself, a nation for himself. And so this one continues talking about the attacks on the Christian heritage, right? Because they want to rewrite history and all this stuff. So in addition to the attack on Christian speech and symbols, there has been a purposefully revising of American history, eliminating the stories of faith that permeate the nation's founding. For example, it is now normal for students to be taught that the Pilgrims came to America for monetary gain, the founders were people of the Enlightenment with little interest in God and matters of faith. So this attempt to redefine America by rewriting her history is a vital part of the secularist strategy to transform the America of Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Lincoln. And the fact is that people and nations derive their sense of identity from their history. To remove or revise a people's history is to make those people vulnerable to being easily molded into something different. Karl Marx was referring to this reality when he wrote, quote, "People without a heritage are easily persuaded," end quote. So in her book, The Rewriting of America's History, Catherine Miller documents just how pervasive this crusade to change America's history is. She points out that this is being carried out not only in the rewriting of textbooks, but also in the rewriting of the original inscriptions on national monuments, changing the meaning to something other than the original intent. As she writes, saying, "It is happening through the rewriting and or reinterpretation of America's historical records. In our national parks, monuments, memorials, landmarks, shrines, and churches, in some cases, changes are subtle. In other words, blatant. It's done through removal of key historic pieces that do not support the current ungodly bias." So the most recent attempt to redefine America by rewriting her past is the New York Times 1619 project. 1619 is the year that the first African slaves arrived in America. The stated goal of the Times project is to, quote, reframe, end quote, American history by claiming that 1619, not 1776, represents the country's true founding. They claim, therefore, that America is racist and corrupt in its very core and in need of fundamental change. Certainly, slavery is a blight on America's history. However, because of what happened in 1726, America is not defined by what happened in 1619. It was in 1726 that a great spiritual awakening began that shaped the spiritual and moral character of America's founding generation. It also broke down racial and cultural barriers, releasing anti-slavery sentiments that would eventually bring about the end of slavery in America. To understand America, one must understand the significance of what happened in 1726. America must know about 1726. Recovering this truth about America's history is critical, for as George Orwell said in his classic book, 1984, it says, quote, "Whoever controls the past controls the future," end quote. And commenting on the demise of nations in world history, Carl Sandburg, winner of 2 Pulitzer Prizes, said, "When a nation goes down or society perishes, one condition may always be found. They forgot where they came from. They lost sight of what had brought them along." Recovering the knowledge of what happened beginning in 1726 is paramount. Therefore, in getting it right about our nation, that year a great spiritual tsunami began that eventually engulfed colonial America in a flood of religious fervor. This great awakening, as it has been called, not only renewed the vision of the Pilgrims and gave birth to an anti-slavery movement, but also had a direct bearing on the founding of the United States of America. In fact, 1726 was the year that defined America. It just goes on to the original vision, cites the Mayflower Compact, right? This is having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith, a voice to plant their first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, as we do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid. The Mayflower Compact, 1620. So this is what I'm saying. This is why I pick up these kinds of books that acknowledge our Christian heritage, right? The providential history. So like American Orthodoxy, if I could call it that, right? It's obviously not secularism, not godlessness, not progressivism, godless progressivism, I mean. So, like, if I could say American Orthodoxy, the American reality is that you live in a biblical America and an American Israel because God founded it. For that reason, why we are a chosen nation, not because we are so powerful and rich and free. It's because God has set apart ourselves, or no, God has set us apart for Himself, right? And so the American covenant, right? I guess that's what I would say. That's why I love this idea of the American Israel covenant nation. I say, yeah, because this will remind you of God. Because godless progressivism and secularism is not going to remind you of God. It will pull you away from it and you'll reap God's wrath. And so this is why we should not allow godless people in our government